Think cooking today is tough? Imagine whipping up dinner with no fridge, no measuring cups, and half your ingredients trying to rot before your eyes. Welcome to the medieval kitchen, where survival met innovation, and some of the smartest cooking tricks in history were born out of pure necessity. But here's the twist. A shocking number of those techniques still work today. Not only that, some of them are being rediscovered by modern chefs and foodies who think they've invented something new. This isn't a story about castles and cauldrons, it's about edible ingenuity. From fermentation hacks that rival kombucha bars to decorative dishes that would put a Michelin chef to shame, medieval cooks were way ahead of their time. You'll never look at sourdough or smoked meat the same way again. Stick around because one of these tricks, used by peasants to stretch leftovers, might just save your next dinner party. Ready to time travel with your taste buds? Let's dive in. If you think your grandma's secret meatloaf recipe is old school, wait until you hear what medieval cooks were pulling off, with no fridges, no stoves, and definitely no stainless steel cookware. In an era when a single spoiled stew could mean death by food poisoning, cooking wasn't just a daily chore, it was high-stakes survival. And yet, in the soot-stained kitchens of castles and cottages alike, medieval cooks pioneered techniques so clever they're still being used today, even if most of us don't realize it. Let's start with a trick that would make even Gordon Ramsay raise an eyebrow: using sour milk on purpose. In medieval times, when milk turned, you didn't throw it out. You made something better. Cooks routinely used curdled milk to create soft cheeses, thicken sauces, or even tenderize meats. This wasn't desperation. It was deliberate chemistry. They understood that acidity breaks down proteins, a principle modern chefs use with buttermilk and yogurt marinades. So next time you're whipping up a buttermilk fried chicken, tip your hat to some anonymous medieval milkmaid. And while we're on the subject of transformation, let's talk about fermentation. Not as a buzzword, but as a medieval necessity. Sauerkraut? Thank the Germans, sure. But their medieval ancestors were already fermenting cabbage to survive harsh winters without fresh produce. Kimchi might be trending now, but peasants in 12th century France were pickling root vegetables with salt brines to extend shelf life and boost flavor. They didn't know about gut flora or probiotics, but they did know their pickled carrots could last 3 months and still make boiled barley taste decent. Here's where it gets wilder. Smoke wasn't just for flavor, it was a preservation weapon. Medieval cooks smoked meats not only to add that rich, deep flavor, but to keep flies, mold, and bacteria at bay. Hanging fish and pork over a low fire meant weeks of extra shelf life, which could mean the difference between feast and famine. Today, we call that barbecue. Back then, they called it survival. And yes, those backyard smoked ribs you post on Instagram? Basically 14th century charcuterie with better lighting. Let's not ignore the subtle art of hiding rot with spice, a trick that's earned a bad rep but actually had some merit. No, they didn't use spices to cover spoiled meat, at least not often, because spices were astronomically expensive. But they did use cloves, cinnamon, and pepper in meat dishes to complement aging flavors and inhibit bacteria. In fact, cloves contain eugenol, a natural antimicrobial. This wasn't about deception, it was early food science. Today's use of spice rubs and marinades echoes the same principle: elevate, preserve, enhance. Now here comes the first real twist. They made food look good on purpose. Forget the idea that medieval food was all gray gruel in wooden bowls. Wealthy households employed trained cooks who knew how to shape dough into animals, paint pastries with saffron glaze, and use flowers as edible garnish. A 14th century cookbook, Le Viandier, even includes recipes for colored jellies made with almond milk and natural dyes. That's not primitive. That's proto-plating. Fast forward to today's Michelin-starred edible art, and the parallels are uncanny. Think medieval folks didn't understand heat control without modern ovens? Think again. They mastered temperature with touch and timing. Recipes often instructed cooks to heat until the back of the hand feels discomfort, or simmer as long as it takes to say 3 Our Fathers. Precise? Not exactly. Effective? Definitely. These tactile cues evolved into the modern low and slow method, braising tough cuts of meat until they're fork tender, just like a peasant stew pot hanging over the hearth. And don't overlook the importance of layering flavors, which medieval cooks understood long before umami became culinary gospel. A typical meat pie might contain minced pork, raisins, saffron, and hard-boiled eggs, salty, sweet, spicy, and savory all at once. This balance wasn't random. It reflected a belief in the medicinal power of harmony in food, rooted in Galenic humoral theory. Weird science, sure, but the resulting dishes had complex, layered tastes modern chefs still strive to replicate. Now, here's a clever one. Pre-roasting ingredients for depth. Cooks would toast grains before boiling them into porridge, or sear meats before stewing. That deepened the flavor, prevented mushiness, and added a roasted note modern foodies would call caramelization. Long before we had fancy Maillard reaction charts, they'd already figured out that browning charmed better. In today's terms, it's like pre-toasting your oats for granola or searing your short ribs before a braise. Ever tried clarifying butter? Medieval cooks beat you to it. Ghee might be trendy now, but it was standard in many medieval kitchens, especially where refrigeration was non-existent. Clarified butter lasted longer, resisted spoilage, and added a luxurious richness to sauces. They didn't call it ghee, they just called it smart. Today, chefs use the same method in sauces and pan frying because of its high smoke point and deep nutty flavor. Let's toss in a modern comparison to drive this home. If you think sous vide is some futuristic innovation, think about cooking meat in clay pots buried in embers overnight. That was their version of low-temperature water bath cooking. Long, slow, evenly distributed heat that made meat fall off the bone tender. We've just replaced coals with machines and plastic bags. We haven't even gotten to their use of edible containers. Bread trenchers were the original biodegradable dishware. Thick, stale bread rounds soaked up gravies, eliminated waste, and doubled as a filler meal for the poor. Sounds gross? Think again. Today's edible coffee cups and taco bowls borrow directly from this medieval practice. Eco-conscious cooking? Turns out it's not so new. All of this reveals one brutal truth. If you were a medieval cook, your job was to outwit bacteria, manage fire by instinct, stretch every scrap, and still impress your lord, or risk getting tossed out of the hall. That pressure birthed an arsenal of techniques that we still admire, copy, and, knowingly or not, use today. But the deeper we go, the more we'll see just how advanced their techniques truly were. Because coming up next, the fermentation hacks that modern scientists still study, and a few forgotten ones we probably should bring back. If you've ever thought fermentation was the domain of modern hipsters or high-end chefs, you might be surprised to learn that medieval cooks were absolute masters of the microbial arts. They didn't have microscopes, petri dishes, or sterile labs, but they had instinct, patience, and a deep cultural memory of what worked. And perhaps nowhere is that more evident than in their sophisticated use of fermentation, not just to preserve food, but to enhance it in ways we're still learning to appreciate. Take bread, for instance. The average medieval peasant didn't walk into a bakery and grab a fluffy white loaf. No, their daily bread was a coarse, dark, rye sourdough, often dense, sour, and full of character. But here's the twist. That sour flavor wasn't an accident. It came from natural wild yeasts and lactobacilli that fermented the dough over hours, sometimes days. This method created a loaf with longer shelf life, more nutrition, and deeper flavor. Sound familiar? That's exactly what's behind the sourdough revival in modern kitchens. But medieval fermentation didn't stop with bread. One of the most astonishingly clever tricks was making ale without hops. Before hops became standard in brewing, people used herbs like yarrow, bog myrtle, and wild rosemary to flavor and preserve their beer. This mixture, called gruit, wasn't just a happy accident. It was an early form of biochemical control. These herbs had antimicrobial properties that helped keep the brew stable longer, while also lending unique regional flavors. It's not far from today's craft beer craze, where brewers infuse saisons with lavender or stouts with chili. Cheesemaking, too, was a fermentation science that the medieval world took to another level. Monasteries in particular became the laboratories of Europe, developing distinct regional cheeses that relied on aging in specific caves, wrapping in certain leaves, or being brushed with wine or beer to promote particular molds. Those stinky blue veins in Roquefort, discovered by accident in a cave in southern France, but intentionally replicated by monks who recognized the value of that sharp, pungent bite. Without refrigeration, this wasn't just preference. It was survival cloaked in culinary brilliance. And let's not forget vinegar. Far from being a waste product, vinegar was actively cultivated from spoiled wine or cider. It became the medieval Swiss Army knife, a disinfectant, a preservative, a base for sauces, and a pickling agent. Households maintained vinegar mothers, gelatinous clumps of acidic bacteria passed down like heirlooms. Sound gross? Maybe. But it's the same process behind artisanal vinegars today, from balsamic to kombucha brewed brews. They understood that sour wasn't spoiled. It was alive. One of the more bizarre but brilliant uses of fermentation came in fish sauces. Yes, long before Worcestershire or Thai Nam Pla, medieval cooks in places like Scandinavia and the Mediterranean made garum-style sauces from fermented fish guts. The smell? Vile. The taste? Rich with umami depth, perfect for seasoning everything from stews to porridges. You'll find echoes of this in modern anchovy paste or miso broth, both of which rely on fermentation to amplify flavor. What's especially remarkable is that these processes weren't written down in lab manuals. They were passed down by observation, song, and habit. Cooks judged readiness by smell, feel, and taste, not thermometers or timers. And yet these methods were astonishingly consistent. They show up in archaeological residues, in monastery inventory lists, and even in court cookbooks where a recipe was as much about technique as it was about ingredients. Now here's the kicker. Many of these fermented foods weren't just tastier, they were safer. In an age before pasteurization, properly fermented milk, meat, and vegetables developed acidity levels and microbial environments that inhibited dangerous pathogens. In other words, the peasants eating sour cabbage and cheese might have been healthier than the nobles chugging untreated raw milk. It's a case where poverty didn't just breed necessity, it bred innovation. And while we're talking about peasant wisdom, here's another underrated trick. The use of wild leeks, onions, and garlic not just for flavor, but for preservation and medicinal value. These strong aromatics weren't just taste enhancers. They were antimicrobial powerhouses. In fact, garlic was sometimes crushed and steeped in vinegar to create a kind of rudimentary antibiotic dressing for wounds. But in the kitchen, it served the double purpose of making bland grains exciting and slowing bacterial growth in meat dishes. Now let's pivot to something that feels utterly modern: seasonal eating. Today it's trendy to eat what's in season. But for medieval cooks, this was the only option. You couldn't buy strawberries in January or lettuce in July. Instead, cooks became masters of maximizing what they had when they had it, and preserving the rest. That meant drying herbs in late summer, storing root vegetables in cellars layered with straw, and making fruit pastes or leathers from excess harvests. Think of it as medieval meal prep, done with zero waste. Interestingly, medieval households also developed early versions of what we now call starter cultures. For example, some dairies would hold back a portion of sour cream or yogurt to inoculate the next batch. Bakers did the same with their sourdough starter. These methods created a continuity of flavor and microbial strength across generations, literally living traditions passed through food. And yes, that trendy jar of sourdough starter you keep in the fridge, it's got a 1,000-year pedigree. Even their use of brining and salting had layers of complexity. Meat was often packed in salt, not just to draw out moisture and preserve it, but to create a dense, umami-rich flavor that mimicked aging. The longer the cure, the deeper the flavor. Today we call that dry aging or charcuterie. They just called it Tuesday. As the medieval table evolved, so did their palate for sweet and sour combinations. Dishes like blancmange or chicken with vinegar and honey weren't accidents. They were deliberate plays on flavor contrast, influenced by Arabic culinary traditions that filtered into Europe via Spain and Sicily. This layering of global flavors, sour fruit with meat, sugar with herbs, predates fusion cuisine by centuries. And it worked in part because fermentation gave them access to both the acidic and sweet elements year-round. Here's a kicker. Even in the darkest corners of medieval kitchens, there were proto-scientists experimenting with yeast blooms, mold growth, and microbial aging. Cooks didn't just follow rote instructions, they observed, tweaked, and sometimes even failed spectacularly. That's how knowledge spread. The baker whose loaf kept too well, the brewer whose ale didn't turn sour, the cheesemaker who discovered the sweet spot in their cave's humidity. These weren't just kitchen workers, they were empirical artisans. And perhaps the most human detail of all? Their senses were their guide. Before digital scales and ovens with timers, everything hinged on taste, texture, color, and sound. The bubble rate of fermenting beer, the hiss of a sizzling pan, the smell of ripening cheese, these were the tools of the trade. And honestly, they still are. So while we like to think we've advanced leaps and bounds from those smoky medieval hearths, the truth is much messier and much more humbling. We didn't invent many of the techniques we now consider modern. We revived them, rediscovered them, rebranded them. The real genius? It was happening centuries ago, in kitchens lit by firelight and filled with the pungent scent of bubbling barrels and rising dough. And we're only halfway through, because up next we'll dive into the visual tricks of the medieval kitchen, the ways they manipulated appearance, texture, and even psychology to turn gruel into gourmet, and how we're still doing it today. If you've ever been fooled by a burger commercial, where the bun is airbrushed, the cheese is fake, and the steam is added with a smoke machine, congratulations. You've been tricked by a very modern version of a medieval playbook. That's right. Long before Instagram filters and food stylists, medieval cooks were masters of visual deception. They didn't just want their food to taste good, they wanted it to look like something out of a royal pageant. And some of their tricks are still hiding in plain sight today. Let's start with a showstopper, the so-called illusion food. In the kitchens of European nobility, cooks would sculpt marzipan into fake fruits, mold meat into the shape of swans, or dye rice and pastries in bold colors using natural pigments, saffron for gold, spinach for green, and even crushed insects for a rich crimson. These dishes weren't just flashy, they were designed to dazzle and confuse. Imagine biting into what looks like a pear and realizing it's almond paste, or carving into a roast boar, only to find it's minced chicken-shaped and browned to deceive the eye. This culinary sleight of hand had purpose. It wasn't just entertainment, it was status. If your cook could make a fish look like a peacock or a pie that released live birds when opened, you were flexing your wealth and innovation. That legendary bird trick? It's recorded in the form of Curie, a 14th century English cookbook. It involved baking a hollow pie crust, stuffing it with live songbirds, and opening it mid-feast. Absurd? Sure, but it made jaws drop, and that was the point. But not all tricks were for show. Many were born from necessity. Take the humble pottage. On its own, it was a gray, goopy stew of grains, legumes, and maybe a scrap of meat. Not exactly appetizing. So cooks began garnishing it with fresh herbs, layering brighter ingredients on top, or serving it in more decorative vessels. The goal was to elevate peasant food to something comforting and hearty, even when it was just another variation of yesterday's dinner. Today, we call that plating. Back then, it was dinner diplomacy. One visual tactic that feels strikingly familiar: layering contrasting colors and textures. A dish like a medieval meat pie might combine golden crust, bright green parsley, deep brown gravy, and the occasional flash of boiled egg white. This wasn't just about nutrition, it was about engaging the eye. That same color balance is what modern chefs obsess over when arranging a dish: soft against crunchy, dark against light, wet against crisp. Speaking of eggs, here's a brilliant trick that's as old as it is genius. Medieval cooks often reused eggshells, not just as vessels, but as molds. A common court illusion dish involves stuffing empty eggshells with flavored custards or minced meat, then sealing them with wax and gently cooking them. When cracked open, the contents mimicked a real egg but offered a sweet or savory surprise. It's culinary theater. And believe it or not, molecular gastronomy chefs today do almost the same thing with foams, spheres, and edible balloons. Another timeless technique? Using edible flowers and herbs for decoration. What we think of as modern fine dining flair, like a violet on a panna cotta, was standard fare in the medieval kitchen. Flowers like marigold, rose, and borage weren't just pretty, they added subtle flavors and scents. Some even had symbolic meaning. Roses for love, violets for loyalty. So that dainty bloom on your modern salad? It has roots stretching back to the herb gardens of a Benedictine monastery. Here's where it gets really meta. Medieval cooks understood the power of food psychology, the idea that what we see affects what we taste. A roast glazed to glisten looked juicier. A dish with symmetry felt more refined. Even the placement of food on trenchers, thick bread plates, followed rules. Sweet and soft foods went in the center, meats along the edge, sauces carefully pooled to avoid mess. These weren't arbitrary. They enhanced the dining experience in ways modern research now backs up. Presentation isn't just for aesthetics, it shapes perception. And this obsession with visual quality extended to color manipulation through cooking methods. Boiling vegetables in ash water to preserve green color. Simmering meats with saffron to simulate richness. Using wine not just for flavor, but to deepen hue. They were constantly tweaking the visual palette of the meal, aware that a bland-looking dish would feel poor, even if it tasted rich. One of the more delightful inventions? Mock meats. During religious fasting periods, meat was off limits for much of the calendar, so cooks improvised. They shaped fish into sausages, or made almond cheese molded into meat-like loaves. They even created eggs out of seasoned purees coated in wax. This wasn't deception for cruelty. It was creativity within constraints, and it fostered culinary innovation we still rely on, especially in plant-based cooking. But presentation wasn't limited to the food itself. It extended to the ritual of serving. The staging of a meal, particularly in elite households, was an orchestrated affair. Trays were paraded in by uniformed servants, dishes unveiled with flourish, and colors coordinated with tapestries and tablecloths. Modern tasting menus with precise timing and curated ambiance. The medieval court did it first. Dinner was theater, and cooks were the backstage magicians. Even glassware and crockery played a role in visual food storytelling. Colored glass jugs, pewter platters, hand-painted ceramics, each added to the impression of opulence or care. In humbler homes, the visual trick was to use a carved wooden bowl with contrasting ingredients to create the illusion of abundance. A splash of bright berries or a drizzle of honey on porridge could make even the leanest meal feel celebratory. Let's not forget the medieval obsession with seasonal symbolism. Dishes were arranged to represent the time of year: lambs in spring, nuts in autumn, preserved fruits in winter. Feasts for religious holidays were laden with iconography: cross-shaped loaves, fish presented in trinity groups, cakes shaped like stars. Every bite told a story, and the visual cues mattered just as much as the taste. This careful manipulation of perception didn't die out. It evolved. Today's food photography tricks, painting grill marks, using motor oil instead of syrup for pancakes, or spritzing fake steam, are just updated versions of the medieval illusion. We're still selling the idea of food as experience, not just sustenance. The irony? Much of this medieval showmanship was born from a lack of resources. With no refrigeration, no plastic packaging, and no artificial dyes, they turned to artistry. They fermented, they sculpted, they colored with plants and minerals. They worked with nature's palette, not against it. Perhaps that's why so many of these techniques are returning today, not just in elite restaurants, but in everyday kitchens. We're reviving the use of natural colors, edible flowers, fermented flavors, and elegant plating, not because we must, but because we can. And because deep down, we know that food should engage all the senses, not just our stomachs. So next time you marvel at a chef's plated masterpiece or drool over a picture-perfect meal on your screen, remember, the roots of that visual magic stretch back through centuries to smoky kitchens and carved wood tables, where cooks turned gruel into gold through pure imagination. But don't hang up your apron just yet, because coming up next, we'll explore the unexpected consequences of these lost techniques, how they changed culture, shaped social class, and even helped define who got to eat what in medieval society, and why some of those patterns are still with us today. The deeper you dig into medieval kitchens, the clearer it becomes. Cooking wasn't just about making food. It was about power. Every spice sprinkled, every loaf baked, every dish served carried social weight. And the more sophisticated the trick or technique, the more it reinforced class divisions. You see, many of the lost cooking methods we've rediscovered today weren't just clever. They were exclusive. They separated the hungry from the honored, the servants from the served. Start with spices. While we now take cinnamon, nutmeg, and black pepper for granted, in the medieval world these were prestige items. A single pound of cloves could cost as much as a cow. So when a noble cook added saffron to a sauce or cardamom to a pastry, it wasn't just about flavor, it was a flex. And don't think the kitchen staff didn't know it. Recipes from elite households often specified the exact amount of spice, not for taste, but to avoid waste and signal wealth. The use of spice wasn't random, it was political. Even salt had status. Rock salt and sea salt weren't equally available. The cleaner, whiter, more refined the salt, the higher the table it landed on. Coarse salt was dumped into cooking pots for servants. The fine, powdery stuff, that was pinched with silver spoons and served in ornate salt cellars at the high table. The phrase "above the salt" wasn't metaphorical. It described your literal position at dinner. Salt was the medieval Michelin star. Now pair that with the methods of cooking. A spit roast required constant attention, a turning buoy, and a massive fire. That meant staff, fuel, and time. Spit-roasted meat was therefore a statement. It said, "We can afford to dedicate a person to turning this for 6 hours straight." Meanwhile, a boiled stew, no matter how flavorful, suggested you lacked resources. The same applies today. Think about the difference in perception between slow-smoked brisket and microwaved leftovers. It's not just the taste, it's the labor and tools behind it. The use of sugar, too, was a defining line. Only the rich had access to refined cane sugar imported from the Mediterranean, and they flaunted it. Sugar sculptures, candied fruit, even sweet sauces on meats were culinary status symbols. Peasants, meanwhile, used honey if they were lucky, molasses if they weren't. The manipulation of sweetness wasn't just a flavor choice, it was class signaling on a silver spoon. Even color played a role. Rich, vibrant food was expensive. Saffron turned rice golden. Beetroot tinted sauces red. Almond milk was used to whiten broths for aesthetics. Colorless or dull food often meant no access to these enhancements. To be served a gray bowl of porridge was a visual reminder of one's place in the social ladder. Today, we filter our food photos to enhance saturation. Back then, they did it with dye and intention. Presentation mattered, but so did access. Only certain people got to eat certain things, often by law. In England, sumptuary laws dictated what classes could eat and where. If you were a merchant, you might be banned from using expensive spices or game meats, not because of scarcity, but because food was a marker of rank. You could literally be fined for eating above your station. It was culinary gatekeeping centuries before Instagram influencers existed. But even among the poor, tricks developed to stretch dignity as far as it could go. Cooks learned to make thin broths seem heartier by adding grains. They roasted bones before boiling to coax out flavor. They layered stale bread with lard and onions to mimic meat's richness. And they recycled leftovers with almost fanatical discipline. That meat pie? It might contain bits of 3 meals, not out of laziness, but out of economic brilliance. The trick was making poverty taste like plenty. Some techniques were born purely out of restriction. Lent, Advent, and weekly fast days required the exclusion of meat, eggs, and dairy. So cooks improvised. Almond milk became the go-to substitute for cream. Fish fat was used instead of lard. They even made cheese from pureed legumes. Religious rules forced innovation, and these workarounds evolved into regional traditions that survive today. Think Italian pasta dishes with no meat, or French onion soup without beef stock. Let's not ignore the gender dynamics either. In many noble houses, men ran the kitchen, but women were the real custodians of everyday food knowledge. Village women controlled fermentation, bread making, herbal seasoning, and dairy production. Their techniques were passed mother to daughter, not written down. That's why so many of these lost tricks aren't in cookbooks. They lived in the hands and instincts of working women who had to stretch a meal, keep a child fed, or make something nourishing out of scraps. Their contributions were vital, but invisible. And yet some of these women did rise through the ranks. A talented female cook could find herself working in a castle kitchen, her skill transforming her social position. But make no mistake, it was a brutal climb. Kitchens were hot, dangerous, and hierarchical. Burns, infections, and backbreaking labor were common. The rewards? Rare. But the pride in producing a perfect sauce or flaky crust? That was currency too. Then there were guilds. In towns, bakers, butchers, brewers, and confectioners formed powerful guilds that regulated recipes, prices, and apprenticeships. These organizations protected trade secrets and defined culinary standards. They were gatekeepers of knowledge. Want to learn how to make the perfect rye loaf? Better get into the Baker's Guild. These rules kept techniques within professional circles, making them hard to access without the right connections. In a way, it was like early culinary school, minus the tuition, plus a whole lot more danger. As the centuries rolled on, many of these tricks faded, not because they stopped working, but because industrialization made them obsolete. Why ferment your own cabbage when you can buy vinegar by the bottle? Why hand-roll pastry when machines do it faster? Techniques that once defined skill and class became relics of a past people wanted to forget. But now, in an era obsessed with authenticity, heritage, and artisanal craft, they're making a comeback. And with that comeback comes a reckoning. We're starting to realize that medieval cooks weren't backward, they were resourceful. That a clay oven and a wooden spoon can produce flavors as complex as any Michelin kitchen. That constraints breed creativity. And that food, more than almost anything else, reveals the true structure of society. So the next time you ferment your own pickles, craft a sourdough loaf, or drizzle honey on cheese, ask yourself, who had access to this in the Middle Ages? Who didn't? And what did that mean? Because up next, we wrap it all up with the final and most unexpected lesson. The enduring legacy of medieval cooking isn't just in our recipes or our restaurant trends, it's in the way we think about food, value skill, and define identity through the meals we make, and the ones we're still rediscovering. So here we are, tracing the breadcrumbs of lost medieval cooking tricks, not just to recipes but to values, what mattered, who mattered, and how meals shaped a civilization. Because as much as those tricks preserved meat, stretched grain, or wowed nobility with dyed jellies, they also preserved memory, stretched tradition, and passed down survival in edible form. And now, in a world of fast food and faster forgetfulness, we're starting to remember what they never truly forgot. At the heart of it all was one essential truth: food was culture. For medieval cooks, especially in rural villages, cooking was a communal act. Ovens were shared, feasts were public, and recipes weren't guarded secrets. They were survival guides written in muscle memory. Today, we pay hundreds for cooking classes or scan QR codes for authentic recipes. Back then, authenticity meant staying alive another winter. And the best cooks weren't the ones with fancy ingredients. They were the ones who could make lentils taste like roast duck with little more than onions, herbs, and fire control. And let's not forget the spiritual weight food carried. Every fast, feast, and famine was tied to the liturgical calendar. Fridays were meatless, not for health, but for heaven. Lent didn't just inspire creativity, it demanded it. And saints' days weren't complete without special cakes, shaped loaves, or honeyed delicacies. In this way, cooking connected people to time, to faith, to the cosmos itself. When you boiled your bones or seasoned your stew, you were doing more than making dinner, you were participating in a sacred rhythm. That's something we've lost. Our food schedules today are driven by delivery apps and discount bins. Seasonality is optional. We can eat strawberries in December, lamb in August, mangoes year-round, but medieval cooks couldn't cheat nature. They had to listen to it. They had to build entire meal plans around what the earth gave them and what could be stored, smoked, brined, or brewed. They didn't eat local. They didn't have a choice. And maybe, just maybe, that forced intimacy with the land produced not only better food, but better instincts. Consider the way they managed scarcity. We think of leftovers as boring. They thought of them as opportunities. That yesterday's stew? It's today's pie filling. That hardened crust? Soaked in broth and turned into a new dish. Bones became broth, whey became animal feed, and even the soot from the oven could be used in ash water for cleaning vegetables. Waste wasn't just frowned upon, it was unheard of. Every morsel mattered. Compare that to modern statistics, where up to 30% of food is wasted globally. Maybe those old kitchens were wiser than we realized. And they weren't just sustainable, they were experimental. You had to be. A new herb, a different firewood, an unusual fish. Every variable was a possible revelation or disaster. There were no standard operating procedures. Cooks operated by feel, intuition, and trust in what their ancestors taught them. A sauce's readiness was tested by dripping it on your thumb. Bread dough was judged by how it pulled from the bowl. That kind of instinct doesn't come from books. It comes from repetition and reverence. But let's not romanticize it. These kitchens were brutal. Burns, infections, missing fingers, these were occupational hazards. And if you failed a noble's feast, you could lose more than your job. You might be fined, humiliated, or worse. A misjudged roast could mean public disgrace. The stakes were high and the pressure relentless. That's part of why the tricks we've explored existed in the first place. They weren't luxury hacks, they were hard-won tools in a daily battle against decay, disease, and disappointment. Yet out of that crucible came brilliance. The smokehouse that made ham last a season, the salted fish that fed armies, the fermented sauce that rescued bland grains. These weren't accidents. They were engineered over centuries of pain, trial, and adaptation. And the fact that so many of them have crept back into our modern world, sourdough, bone broth, pickling, seasonal eating, proves just how timeless they are. And maybe that's the most important twist of all. We didn't just inherit these tricks. We resurrected them. We brought them back from the edge of extinction because something in us knows they work. Not just practically, but emotionally. Making your own bread doesn't just save money, it connects you to 1,000 years of hands doing the same thing. Serving a fermented relish isn't just trendy, it's a nod to some nameless cook who survived winter by trusting mold and salt and time. And while we have more tools than ever, digital thermometers, instant read scales, refrigeration that obeys the touch of a button, we also have more noise, more clutter, more processed distractions masquerading as food. So when we reach back and rediscover these medieval methods, we're not just cooking, we're recentering. We're remembering that food is slow, sacred, and worth getting wrong a few times. Because those cooks didn't get it right on the first try either. They burned loaves, they undercooked fish, they spoiled milk, but they learned. And they passed those lessons on, sometimes in song, sometimes in whispered advice, sometimes in the quiet gesture of a mother's hand guiding her daughters on the mixing bowl. So what do we take away from all of this? Maybe it's that the past isn't dead, it's dinner. That inside every kitchen gadget or gourmet trend is an echo of something older, grittier, and often wiser. That our ancestors weren't just surviving, they were thriving, innovating, creating beauty in the hardest of circumstances. Maybe next time we sprinkle salt, we remember it once denoted nobility. Maybe when we ferment cabbage, we think of it as microbial magic handed down across centuries. And maybe when we make a meal from scratch, without shortcuts, we do it not just for nourishment, but for continuity. Because in the end, the real trick of medieval cooking wasn't in the spice rack or the fire pit. It was in the mindset. Make do, use everything, trust your senses, and cook like it matters. And maybe, just maybe, that's the trick we need to relearn most of all. So, next time you slice into sourdough, drizzle honey over cheese, or admire the glossy sheen on a perfectly plated dish, remember, you're walking in the footsteps of medieval cooks who did it all without electricity, refrigeration, or even recipes on paper. Their kitchens were smoky, their tools crude, but their creativity? Off the charts. What they lacked in gadgets, they made up for in grit, instinct, and deep knowledge passed down across generations. We like to think of ourselves as modern, but the truth is, we're just looping back, relearning the lost arts of flavor, preservation, and sustainability. And maybe that's a good thing. Because if medieval cooks could make miracles out of scraps, what's stopping us from doing the same? Now we want to hear from you. Which of these tricks blew your mind the most? Have you used any of them without even realizing it? And what do you think today's kitchens could still learn from the past? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you loved this deep dive into culinary history, don't forget to subscribe and ring that bell. We've got more lost knowledge to uncover, and trust us, it only gets weirder from here.